For our next exercise, we're going to work with ink and a brush. To start for this exercise, you're going to need a few things. The first thing that you're going to need is a piece of smooth surface Bristol. So no more working on just regular copy paper at this point. I'd like you to work on a piece that's at least 9 by 12 inches. This can be found on the front countertop in the classroom. You're also going to need your 6H or 4H pencil, an eraser, either your kneaded or your plastic eraser would be fine, and then a three-dimensional object that takes up space. So the object can come from our still life cabinet, or you could plan to bring your own object from home. If you have a particular object that's going to show up in your illustration, your final project, if you'd like to practice with that, you could bring it into class and you could start doing this exercise with that object. And that would just better prepare you for when you do your final project. The first step is going to be lightly drawing the object on the paper. You want to make sure that your object takes up the space on the paper and isn't like super small. So make sure that it's at least half the size of the paper. And then if there's anything you'd like to do in the background, that can be filled in with washes, which we'll work with later. So this is the first part of this series of videos to go over this exercise for your learning guide. So the first thing we're going to do is just sketch it in pencil. Okay, now that I'm almost finished with my sketch, I wanted to point out some observations that I was making that I'd like you to capture in your piece as well. As I was going through and sketching my object, I really took careful notice of all of the edges and contours of the object. I also went a step further and tried to mark where the lights and the darks met and added contoured edges to the edges of the shadows and the middle tones and the highlights and where they butted against each other. This will just make the next steps that we're moving on to easier. The next step is going to be adding line with ink, just black ink. After that, we're going to add gray washes with perhaps some hints of color in places. And then the last step will be to add some gouache, white gouache over top for the highlights. And so having the edges marked out where the lights and the shadows meet will be really helpful for the next few steps for this process. So it's really important that you always start with a good sketch, but particularly in this project, I think it will be helpful that you're thinking about the edges and contours really carefully and capturing them in detail, especially when it comes to highlights, shadows, and middle tones. Now, as I start to tidy my edges up even more and just add a little bit more detail with my pencil, I'm just going to take this small clicky eraser just to kind of thin out any like hairy lines that I no longer need and clean up some edges, just to make it less confusing when I start adding ink. And the nice thing is the ink will cover the pencil, and also you'll be able to erase the pencil after the ink has been applied and has dried. So that will be kind of the nice part of this process, is that you will be able to leave some pencil there, but we just don't want so much that it gets confusing once you get to those steps. Okay. And then I also want to show you closely the soda can tab so I can kind of point out some of the things that I'm talking about. Okay, so some things that I wanted to point out is, like, I showed how you can actually see the different dimensions and parts of the soda can tab. And so I started to observe like this inner part right here, this little edge right here that's like on the inside of the tab is actually going to be white in my final piece. And so I'm just starting to kind of mark those areas off, and then also look for places where like the shadow gets a little bit darker. There's kind of like a dimple in the metal here, and so I'm going to add that in as well, just to make things a little bit easier. Now, I don't want you to take forever on this exercise and like be like insanely laborsome on this piece, because we want to save that commitment for your final project. But I do want to be able to see that you are making these observations, that you are in your sketch starting to think about where the lights and the shadows are, where the highlights and the midtones are, and you're able to block those out and see those, because otherwise once you get to the ink it's going to be really difficult.